January 9th, 1945, Steinbach, Germany. The Roer River cuts through the frozen Rhineland like a black scar across pale skin. Ice crystals cling to bare tree branches that hang over the water's edge, each one glinting silver in the predawn darkness. The temperature has dropped to -12 degrees Celsius. German soldiers huddle in their bunkers along the eastern bank, their breaths forming white clouds in the frigid air, their fingers wrapped around cold steel, watching the opposite shore with exhausted vigilance. They have held this river for months, and they believe they will hold it for months more. Rivers are ancient defenders. Rivers do not negotiate. In the logic of defensive warfare, a riverline is supposed to be sacred, inviolable, especially when your enemy must cross under direct fire in winter, with every advantage on your side, but 300 meters across the water. American combat engineers are already moving in the darkness. They do not speak. They carry pontoons on their shoulders like pallbearers, heavy rubber boats that smell of gasoline and canvas. They move with the practiced silence of men who have rehearsed this moment 100 times in their minds, knowing that when dawn breaks in 2 hours, everything will change. They know the statistics. They know that bridging operations under fire produce casualty rates that approach 50%. They know that German artillery observers are dug in on the high ground beyond the river, with pre-registered coordinates on every likely crossing point. They know all of this, and still they move forward, because the American war machine does not recognize rivers as permanent obstacles. It recognizes them as temporary inconveniences. This is the story of how an impossible bridge was built in an impossible place under impossible conditions, and what it revealed about the fundamental asymmetry between two warring philosophies, one built on endurance and sacrifice, the other built on abundance and audacity. The Roer River offensive was born from strategic desperation disguised as operational confidence. By January 1945, the Allied advance into Germany had stalled along a front that stretched from the Netherlands to the Swiss border. The Rhine remained the ultimate objective, but between the Allied armies and that final natural barrier lay the Roer, a smaller but equally treacherous obstacle that the Germans had transformed into a fortress. The Wehrmacht had flooded the surrounding plains by destroying the Roer dams upstream, turning the river valley into a frozen marsh that swallowed vehicles and men with equal indifference. They had mined every road, every field, every likely assembly area. They had positioned the remaining artillery and armor to cover every approach. The American 1st and 9th Armies faced a mathematical problem that appeared insoluble. To cross the Roer, they would need bridges. To build bridges, they needed time. Time under fire was measured in bodies. The engineers calculated that constructing a tactical bridge capable of supporting armor and heavy vehicles would require between 6 and 8 hours of continuous work, assuming optimal conditions, no enemy interference, and perfect execution. None of those assumptions were realistic. Enemy fire would be immediate and devastating. Conditions were Arctic, and perfection was a fantasy that died quickly in combat. Yet the order came down from Supreme Headquarters: cross the Roer, establish bridgeheads, advance to the Rhine. The timeline was inflexible. The method was left to the men who would have to execute it. Among those men was Colonel James R. Hargrove, commander of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion. Hargrove was 42 years old, a career engineer who had spent his peacetime years building hydroelectric dams in the American Northwest. He understood water and steel and mathematics. He also understood that engineering was not merely a science, but an act of faith, a willingness to impose human order onto chaos through sheer determination and superior resources. He had fought across France and into Germany, and he had come to recognize a fundamental truth about modern warfare that the Germans were only beginning to comprehend. in an industrial war of attrition. Abundance was its own form of weaponry. The Germans prepared for war as an exercise in efficiency. They calculated carefully. They rationed their resources. They designed their defenses around the assumption that their enemies would be similarly constrained by scarcity, forced to choose between competing priorities, unable to sustain multiple simultaneous efforts. This was rational thinking for a nation that had never known true industrial abundance, that had spent the entire war managing shortages and substituting ersatz materials for real ones. But American engineers did not think in terms of scarcity. When Hargrove's battalion prepared for the row crossing, they assembled enough bridging equipment to build 4 complete bridges simultaneously. They stockpiled enough timber, steel, and pontoon sections to rebuild each bridge twice over if necessary. They positioned enough ammunition, food, and medical supplies to sustain operations for a week without resupply. This was not efficiency. This was overwhelming, almost absurd abundance turned into tactical doctrine, and it terrified the Germans who witnessed it. The first assault waves crossed the Row before dawn on January 9. Infantrymen in rubber boats paddling through black water while German machine guns opened fire from the opposite bank. Tracer rounds drew red lines across the river's surface. Men fell into the freezing water and drowned before they could scream. Others made it across, scrambling up muddy embankments under fire, establishing a fragile toehold on the eastern shore. By 0530 hours, 3 separate bridgeheads had been secured. Each one a tiny semicircle of captured ground barely 200 meters deep. And behind them, the engineers were already launching their pontoons. The bridge they intended to build was a tactical Bailey Bridge, a modular structure invented by the British that could be assembled rapidly using prefabricated steel panels. Each panel weighed 270 kilograms. Each one had to be carried to the water's edge, positioned precisely, bolted to its neighbor, and secured against the current. The work required 30 men operating in perfect coordination, exposed on the riverbank, silhouetted against the water, under continuous observation by enemy artillery spotters. German 105mm howitzers opened fire at 05 for 7 hours. The first shells landed in the water, sending up geysers of white spray that drenched the engineers and capsized the pontoons. The second salvo landed on the western bank, killing 4 men instantly and wounding 7 others. The survivors did not retreat. They dragged the wounded to cover, repositioned their equipment, and resumed work. Within 6 minutes, replacement engineers moved forward to fill the gaps. This was American tactical doctrine distilled to its essence. Casualties were anticipated, accounted for, and immediately replaced. There was always another man, another pontoon, another steel panel by 0630 hours. The bridge had extended 40 meters into the river. German mortar joined the artillery barrage, walking their fire across the construction site with methodical precision. The engineers worked through it, some wearing steel helmets, some bareheaded because helmets interfered with their vision. They worked with the mechanical rhythm of factory laborers, each man performing his assigned task without deviation, trusting that the man beside him would do the same. When a shell landed close enough to knock a panel loose, they repositioned it. When a pontoon took shrapnel and began to deflate, they dragged a replacement into position. The bridge continued to grow. On the eastern bank, German forward observers watched through field glasses and reported what they saw with a mixture of disbelief and mounting dread. They had destroyed the bridge twice already, or so they thought, but each time the Americans simply absorbed the damage and continued building, as if the destruction itself was just another variable in a mathematical equation that would inevitably resolve in their favor. The observers called for more artillery, but ammunition was scarce. The Wehrmacht was rationing shells now. issuing strict quotas for each gun battery while across the river. American engineers were building a bridge using enough steel to construct a small factory. This disparity was not accidental. It was the culmination of a strategic philosophy that had defined American warfighting since 1942, when the industrial mobilization shifted into full capacity. The United States had entered the war late and unprepared, with an army that ranked 17th in the world in size and capability. But it possessed something no other combatant nation could match: an industrial infrastructure of staggering scale, untouched by bombing, staffed by a workforce that numbered in the tens of millions, capable of producing war materials at rates that defied rational comprehension. By 1945, American factories were producing 1 aircraft every 5 minutes, 1 tank every 7 minutes, 1 ship every day. The sheer volume of production had transformed American tactical thinking. Unlike German or Soviet commanders who carefully husbanded their resources, American officers could afford to be profligate. They could call in artillery barrages that expended more shells in an hour than some German divisions possessed in total. They could replace destroyed vehicles within days. They could issue their combat engineers enough bridging equipment to span every river in Germany twice over, because there was no meaningful scarcity to restrain them. German soldiers who had fought on the Eastern Front understood mass. They had faced Soviet attacks where quantity substituted for quality, where waves of men and tanks simply overwhelmed defensive positions through sheer numerical superiority. But the Soviet mass was crude, unsophisticated. It was suffering weaponized. The American abundance was something different. It was industrial precision married to unlimited resources. Every American soldier seemed to have everything he could possibly need, and backup supplies for items he hadn't even thought of yet. They ate hot meals in forward positions. They received mail regularly. They had cigarettes, chocolate, coffee, razor blades, clean socks. Their wounded received blood, plasma, and antibiotics that German doctors had only read about in medical journals. The Americans fought as if scarcity was a concept that had been abolished by executive order, and nowhere was this more evident than in their engineering operations. German combat engineers were trained to improvise, to make do with whatever materials they could scavenge, to build bridges from local timber and rope if necessary. American engineers arrived with everything prefabricated, pre-tested. They built bridges from assembly kits that came in numbered crates with illustrated instruction manuals. They approached river crossings the way factory foremen approached production quotas, as problems that could be solved through proper planning and adequate resource allocation. By 07, for 5 hours, the Roer Bridge had reached the halfway point. The structure stretched 150 meters across the dark water, swaying slightly in the current, its steel framework covered in frost. The engineers had sustained 23 casualties so far, but the work had not slowed. Replacement crews rotated in seamlessly, and the bridge continued to extend meter by meter toward the eastern bank. German artillery had shifted to interdiction fire now, targeting the approach roads and assembly areas rather than the bridge itself, trying to prevent reinforcements from reaching the crossing site. It was a tacit admission that the bridge could not be stopped, only delayed. On the eastern shore, the infantry bridgehead had expanded to 500 meters. American tanks were assembling on the western bank now, their engines idling, crews waiting for the bridge to be completed so they could cross and exploit the breakthrough. Everything was proceeding according to plan, which itself was extraordinary given that combat plans rarely survived contact with reality. But American plans were built with enough redundancy, enough backup systems, enough excess capacity to withstand enormous attrition and still function. This was not elegance. This was brute force logistics elevated to an art. Form, Lieutenant Kurt Steinman, of the Wehrmacht's 9th Panzer Division watched the bridge construction from a concealed observation post 2 kilometers east of the river. He had been fighting since 1939, from Poland through France and Russia, and now back to Germany itself. He had witnessed the entire arc of the Reich's trajectory from triumph to desperation, and as he watched the American engineers work under fire, methodically extending their bridge despite casualties that would have halted any German operation, he understood with sudden clarity that the war had never really been a military contest at all. It had been an economic competition disguised as armed conflict, and Germany had lost it before the first shot was fired. In his diary that night, Steinman wrote, "They build as if they have infinite materials. Perhaps they do. We fight with what we have, rationing every shell, every liter of fuel. They fight with such abundance that they can afford to waste. This is not courage or skill. This is wealth in uniform. We are fighting an economy, not an army." The bridge was completed at 11:34 hours, 6 hours and 47 minutes after the first pontoon was launched. The final steel panel was bolted into place while German artillery continued to fall around the construction site, though with decreasing accuracy as American counter-battery fire destroyed or suppressed the enemy gun positions. The engineers did not celebrate. They immediately began constructing a second bridge 400 meters downstream, because redundancy was doctrine. If one bridge was destroyed, traffic would simply shift to the alternate crossing. There was no single point of failure in American operations, because failure implied scarcity of options, and scarcity was not part of the vocabulary. The first vehicle across was a Sherman tank from the 2nd Armored Division, weighing 32 tons, its tracks clanking on the steel decking. The bridge held without flexing. Behind it came more tanks, followed by trucks carrying infantry, ammunition, fuel, food, medical supplies, engineers with more bridging equipment, communications teams, artillery spotters, chaplains, journalists, and the entire logistical apparatus of modern mobile warfare. Within 2 hours, over 800 vehicles had crossed the row, pouring into the bridgehead like water through a broken dam. The Germans attempted a counterattack at 1400 hours, throwing their remaining armor reserves against the expanding American position. But the attack collapsed within 30 minutes under coordinated artillery and airstrikes. The bridgehead was secure. The Rhine was now within reach. German soldiers who surrendered in the following days told their interrogators the same story in different words. They had expected the river to hold. They had been told that the Americans would take weeks to bridge the row, if they could bridge it at all. The river was too wide, the current too strong, the defensive fire too intense. These were the comfortable lies that exhausted armies tell themselves. And then they watched the Americans build a bridge in 6 hours, under continuous fire, losing men and simply replacing them, expending materials as if cost was irrelevant. It was psychologically devastating to realize that your enemy possessed such overwhelming resources that they could afford to solve problems through sheer application of excess capacity. It meant that there was no defense except exhaustion, no strategy except hoping the Americans would simply decide the victory wasn't worth the effort. The symbolic weight of that bridge extended far beyond its tactical significance. It represented a fundamental truth about the nature of American power that German military theorists had failed to comprehend until it was too late. They had studied American military history and concluded that Americans were poor soldiers, undisciplined and soft, lacking the martial virtues cultivated by European armies through centuries of warfare. They had noted American failures in past conflicts, their hesitant entry into both world wars, their apparent preference for negotiation over confrontation. These observations were not entirely wrong, but they missed the essential point. American strength had never been martial in the traditional sense. It was industrial, economic, organizational. Americans did not produce superior soldiers. They produced superior systems. Those systems were visible in every aspect of the row crossing. The engineers who built the bridge had trained for 6 months in England, practicing river crossings on scale models of German river defenses. They had been issued detailed reconnaissance photographs showing every German bunker, every likely artillery position, every tree line and road junction. They had weather forecasts, current measurements, soil composition analyses, and tactical maps updated daily by aerial reconnaissance. They knew more about the Roer River Valley than many German soldiers who had been stationed there for months. This was information warfare before the term existed. The Americans gathered intelligence through vast bureaucratic machinery that employed thousands of analysts, translators, photographers, and interpreters. They processed captured documents, interrogated prisoners, debriefed refugees, analyzed enemy radio traffic, and synthesized all of it into operational intelligence that flowed down to battalion and company level. German commanders operated in comparative darkness, relying on sporadic reports and increasingly unreliable field communications. They made decisions based on incomplete information, while their American counterparts planned operations with near-total battlefield awareness, and behind all of it was the logistical system that transported the men, materials, and information to the front. American logistics were not an afterthought or a support function. They were the core strategy. The famous Red Bull Express truck convoys that supplied the Allied advance across France moved 12,000 tons of supplies per day at their peak, operating like a transcontinental railroad without tracks. Port battalions unloaded cargo ships faster than they could be filled. Engineer battalions built roads, airfields, and bridges at rates that German intelligence initially dismissed as impossible exaggerations. The entire American war effort was a demonstration of organizational capacity applied to violence. And it was unstoppable not because of superior tactics or individual courage, but because of superior systems running at scale. There was a moment, captured in photographs taken by Signal Corps cameramen, when the Roe Bridge stood completed just after dawn on January 10th. The river mist had risen, turning everything soft and grey, and the bridge extended across the water like a steel thread connecting to different worlds. On the western bank, American supply dumps stretched back to kilometers, vast orderly fields of crated equipment and stacked fuel drums guarded by MPs in clean uniforms. On the eastern bank, the landscape was cratered and burned, a wasteland of destroyed villages and abandoned defensive positions. The contrast was almost allegorical: abundance confronting scarcity, organization facing chaos, the future dominating the past. German prisoners were made to walk across that bridge as they were evacuated to rear area camps. Many of them stopped midway, looking back at the eastern shore where they had fought and forward to the western shore, where they would spend the rest of the war in captivity. Some of them wept. Others simply stared in silence at the American supply columns that continued to roll across the bridge in an unending stream. They had known they were losing. They had known since Stalingrad, perhaps earlier. But knowing abstractly that your enemy has superior resources is different from standing on a bridge built in 6 hours under fire and watching tank after tank after tank roll past while your own army has no fuel for the tanks it still possesses. One prisoner, a sergeant from Hamburg named Friedrich Wolf, later told American interviewers, "We thought you would fight like Germans fight, carefully, preserving resources, making each shell count. But you fight like you're rich men who don't care about the cost of anything. You use 10 shells where we would use 1. You send supplies forward as if they grow on trees. And the terrible thing is that it works. You can afford to be wasteful because you have so much to waste. We cannot afford anything, so we lose. This observation cut to the heart of the matter. The American way of war was profligate, excessive, seemingly inefficient. It discarded damaged equipment rather than repairing it. It transported fresh food to frontline units instead of issuing preserved rations. It provided every infantryman with a semi-automatic rifle when bolt-action rifles were perfectly adequate. It built 2 bridges when one would theoretically suffice. All of this appeared wasteful from the perspective of a resource-constrained military. But it was actually devastating strategic logic. If you possess overwhelming resources, you eliminate risk by applying excess capacity to every problem. You don't calculate the minimum necessary force. You apply overwhelming force and accept the inefficiency as the cost of certainty. The engineers who built the Roer Bridge understood none of this philosophy at a theoretical level. They were not strategists or economists. They were welders and carpenters and high school graduates from Ohio and California and Texas. Men who in peacetime had worked in factories or on construction sites or not worked at all. They built the bridge because they were ordered to build it, and they built it despite casualties because that was the job. But in their tools and materials and methods, they carried the accumulated industrial and organizational capacity of an entire nation that had turned its vast commercial infrastructure toward military production. Every steel panel in that bridge had been manufactured in Pittsburgh or Gary by workers who never saw combat, but whose labor was as essential as any soldiers. The trucks that transported the panels from port to assembly. Area burned gasoline refined in Texas from oil pumped in Oklahoma. The food the engineers ate came from farms in Iowa and Kansas, processed in Chicago, shipped across the Atlantic, and delivered to the front with a regularity that German soldiers found almost supernatural. The medical supplies that saved wounded engineers' lives were produced by pharmaceutical companies that had existed in peacetime and simply added production lines when war came. The entire American war economy was structured around the principle of converting abundance into strategic advantage, and the Roer Bridge was a tiny but perfect example of that conversion process. By contrast, German engineers at the same point in the war were being ordered to construct defensive obstacles using materials salvaged from destroyed buildings, because steel was too scarce to allocate for field fortifications. They were repairing damaged vehicles using parts cannibalized from other damaged vehicles, creating a death spiral of declining operational readiness. They were limiting artillery support not because they lacked guns, but because they lacked shells. And they were watching American engineers build bridges out of factory-fresh materials under enemy fire. Work that would have been impossible for German units to replicate, even without enemy interference. The bridge stood for 4 weeks before it was finally replaced by a permanent structure. During that time, it carried over 40,000 vehicles and 200,000 soldiers across the Roer. It was damaged multiple times by German artillery and once by a desperate Luftwaffe bombing raid that killed 12 engineers and destroyed 30 meters of decking. Each time, American repair crews rebuilt the damaged sections within hours, working under lights at night when necessary, applying the same methodical abundance that had built the original structure. The bridge became something more than infrastructure. It became a symbol of inevitable victory, a physical manifestation of the idea that some wars are decided not on battlefields, but in factories and supply depots, and that all the courage and sacrifice in the world cannot overcome an enemy who can simply outproduce you. There is a small cemetery near Steinbach where 47 American engineers are buried. Men who died building or defending bridges during the winter of 1945. Their graves are marked with simple white crosses arranged in perfect rows, maintained by the German government in perpetuity as part of the terms of surrender. Local German families visit sometimes, leaving flowers, trying to make sense of the young faces in the photographs that appear on grave markers. These were not the victors they had been taught to fear, the cruel conquerors from propaganda films. These were boys from places with names like Iowa and Nebraska who had died building a bridge over a river they had never heard of before the war. What did those deaths mean? In the immediate tactical sense, they meant that American armor crossed the Roe ahead of schedule and advanced toward the Rhine, shortening the war by days or possibly weeks. In the broader strategic sense, they meant that the American system of war, industrial, abundant, logistically driven, had proven itself superior to the German system of war, which was built on discipline and efficiency and careful rationing of scarce resources. But in the largest sense, the deaths meant that young men had been fed into a vast impersonal machine that converted industrial capacity into territorial conquest. And they had played their small necessary part in that conversion. The bridge itself was dismantled in March 1945 after permanent crossings were established. The steel panels were loaded onto trucks and transported forward to be used in new bridges over new rivers as the Allied advance continued. Nothing was wasted. The pontoons were deflated, repaired, and shipped to engineering depots in France to await their next employment. The timber supports were repurposed for field fortifications. Even the damaged sections were returned to salvage yards, where they were assessed for repair or recycling. The entire operation reflected the American approach to warfare: systematic, logistical, efficient in its own excessive way. German soldiers, who witnessed the bridge construction and later survived the war, carried the memory of that 6-hour span of steel and fire for the rest of their lives. In interviews conducted decades later, veterans spoke about the Roe crossing with a particular quality of resignation, as if they were describing not a battle but an inevitability. A moment when the abstract reality of American industrial power became concrete and undeniable. They had been told their entire military careers that spirit and willpower could overcome material disadvantage. The Roe Bridge proved that slogan to be a lie. Material advantage, when sufficiently overwhelming, rendered spirit and willpower irrelevant. This was perhaps the deepest lesson of the bridge: that modern warfare had evolved beyond individual courage or tactical brilliance into a contest of systems and resources, and that the nation which could field superior systems fueled by superior resources would win regardless of the martial virtues possessed by its enemies. The German soldier was arguably better trained, more experienced, more dedicated to his cause than his American counterpart. But the American soldier arrived at the battlefield supported by a logistical and industrial infrastructure so vast that it could absorb catastrophic losses and simply continue operating without degradation of capability. That asymmetry decided the war more than any battle or campaign. In the years after the war, engineers studied the Roe crossing as a model of combat bridge construction under fire. The techniques developed there, the modular approach, the redundant systems, the prefabricated components, became standard doctrine in Western military engineering. The Bailey Bridge itself became an icon, used in military and civilian applications worldwide. A testament to the principle that good engineering could solve almost any problem if provided adequate resources and proper planning. But the bridge's legacy extended beyond engineering manuals and tactical doctrine. It represented a moment of transformation in the nature of power itself. For centuries, military strength had been measured in the quality of soldiers and the brilliance of generals. The Industrial Revolution had added productive capacity to that equation, but it remained secondary to the traditional martial virtues. The Second World War, and specifically moments like the Roe crossing, proved that productive capacity had become the primary determinant of military power. The nation that could produce more, transport more, deploy more, and replace more would prevail regardless of its soldiers' courage or its generals' genius. This was not the romantic vision of warfare that had animated military thought for millennia. There was nothing heroic about overwhelming your enemy through superior logistics. There was no glory in winning because you could afford to build 2 bridges while your enemy could barely build 1, but it was devastatingly effective. And it marked the beginning of a new era in which wars would be decided as much by economists and factory managers as by soldiers and commanders. The men who built the Roer Bridge did not think in these terms. They thought in terms of inches gained, panels bolted, pontoons positioned. They measured their success by whether the bridge held, whether their buddies survived, whether they would get hot coffee at the end of their shift. The grand strategic implications were invisible to them, or irrelevant. They were not philosophers of power. They were craftsmen doing dangerous work under terrible conditions, and they did it because it was expected of them and because they trusted that someone, somewhere, had a plan that made sense of their suffering. At night, when the bridge was illuminated by portable lights so that supply convoys could continue crossing in darkness, it looked almost delicate, a thread of steel stretched across black water, glowing in the cold air. German artillery would sometimes fire at the lights, and the engineers would extinguish them and work in darkness for a while before relighting them when the barrage passed. This became routine. Everything became routine eventually, even building bridges under fire. There is a photograph, taken by an unknown signal corps photographer, that shows 3 engineers working on the bridge in early morning light. They are bolt fastening a panel, their faces invisible beneath their helmets, their breath visible in the cold air. Behind them, the river stretches away into mist, and beyond that, Germany itself lies waiting. The photograph is unremarkable, just 3 men doing manual labor in wartime. But it captures something essential about the American war effort, that victory was built by anonymous labor, repeated millions of times, by men who would never be remembered individually, but whose collective effort reshaped the world. Those 3 men might have survived the war. They might have returned to America, married, raised children, worked ordinary jobs, and died ordinary deaths without ever thinking much about the bridge. They built in January 1945, or they might have died a week later, or a day later, killed by artillery or accident or simple bad luck. The photograph does not tell us. It only shows the work, the steel and water and cold air, the mundane heroism of men doing difficult things because those things needed to be done, and that, finally, is what the bridge meant. Not strategy or philosophy or the transformation of warfare, but work performed and completed, an obstacle crossed, a problem solved through the application of labor and resources and stubborn determination. The rest, the implications, the symbolism, the lessons, those came later, added by historians and analysts trying to make sense of events that the participants experienced only as noise and cold, and fear and the weight of steel on their shoulders. The bridge stood, the river was crossed, the war continued. And somewhere in the accumulated weight of such moments, such crossings and constructions and small, impossible victories, the shape of the larger victory became visible, inevitable, already determined by forces that individual soldiers could not see but that they, nevertheless, embodied in every bolt fastened and every panel positioned under fire. They built a bridge. That was all, and that was everything. The steel held, the current flowed beneath it, and the future rolled across on tank treads and truck tires, heading east toward the final rivers and the final RECONINGS. In the end, the impossible bridge was built not because of courage or genius, though both were present. But because the men who built it possessed something simpler and more decisive, they had enough steel, enough time bought with blood, enough hands to replace the hands that fell, and enough faith in their own abundance to believe that no river could stop them permanently. That faith was justified. The bridge stood. The river was conquered, and the lesson endured, written in steel and sacrifice across cold water, that some obstacles cannot be defended against enemies who possess not merely courage, but unlimited capacity to bring resources to bear until the obstacle ceases to exist. The Roe flows on, indifferent to history, freezing each winter and thawing each spring. The bridge is long gone, dismantled and repurposed, and forgotten except in archives and memories. But the principle it represented, that abundance properly applied could overcome any defense, that systems and resources could trump individual valor, that some wars were decided not on battlefields but in factories, that principle endured, shaping the architecture of power for the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. The engineers who built it would not have understood that. They only knew that they were given a job, impossible by any reasonable measure, and they did it anyway because impossible is only another word for difficult. When you have enough steel and enough hands and enough willingness to pay the price, and America, in 1945, had enough of everything except patience for obstacles that rivers represented. So the bridge was built, the impossible was accomplished, and the river was crossed. And the war already won in Detroit and Pittsburgh and the factory floors of a nation that had turned its enormous commercial energy toward military production, rolled forward toward its inevitable conclusion.